So what I wanted to open up with is just, most of you have done this before, Jamie. It's really, the intention is to have this be very emergent. I've never done it this way before, where I've come with a topic in mind, but because there was so much interest in this topic, I felt like it would be fun to actually have this intentional. But really, we're going to go with how it's been in the past, which is, bring what's most alive for you. I will open up and share something around the topic. And then really the only desires I have as a group is that we just speak from our direct experience. If you want to share something, speak about how that's really moving you, living in you. I think it can be easy to go into theoretical, more abstract dialogue around things like this. And I'm not opposed to that, but I think the richness is in how is it living in us, and what is that stirring, or what is it bringing up in us that we get to share with one another. So that's one. And then if you find yourself feeling like activated or triggered by any of the content, just to be able to give yourself a minute to pause, and even you can name it. It's like, wow, part of what I want to do is bring our bodies along. So maybe you want to open up saying, like, I notice that my heart is racing. I feel really vulnerable sharing this. But just, again, another invitation to speak from whatever is occurring in the moment. So that's really the framework. And I thought what would be kind of fun to open this is to start with a little exercise. And basically all I want to do is I want to ask you to turn inward. So you can keep your eyes open or closed, but if you can access more of what's happening inside of you by closing your eyes, my invitation is to do that. And I'll just walk you through two little exercises. And the intention here is just to see what happens inside of you. There's no really other endpoint here than just to notice what happens. So first, just begin by, what do you notice when you turn inside? What's present for you? Maybe you notice your breath. Maybe you notice something happening in your body. Maybe you have thoughts. Just whatever's here, just notice that. And then I'm going to, if you're not on mute, maybe just double check and make sure that your microphone's on mute. I want to now just offer you a couple of words. And the intent of this is just to really notice what happens when you hear the words. So notice what happens when you hear masculinity is safe and healing. And if someone has their microphone on, if you could just adjust that and turn on mute, that would be really helpful. So I'm just going to offer that again, just to see what you noticed. What happens when you hear the words, masculinity is safe and healing? And so just taking note, whatever arose for you, whether it was thoughts or feelings or nothing, just whatever was there. And then just see if you can clean the slate of that. You can even do a little shake of your body if that feels good. And now we're just going to do one more. So notice what happens when you hear masculinity is confusing and dangerous. What happens inside of you when you hear those words? And then we're just going to transition back together. So when you're ready, just open your eyes. And again, if you want to shake your body a little bit and just, and I'm going to open up the framework of where we're going, but I just want to see if anybody wants to share anything that arose with either of those. If you're still really in a space, just feel free to stay there. If there's anything that you notice that you'd want to share. Our bodies hold a lot of information, sometimes information that our minds aren't quite connected to or aware of. Like we have these ideas or we've been socialized to think certain things, but our body, and I know that this is a common topic, our body holds not only our history, but our ancestral history. So we're, and we could tie that even to humanity, not just our lineage of our maternal and paternal lines, but like all of humanity. So I appreciate you naming like what actually, there was quite a direct experience in your body. Anyone else want to share anything before we shift?
Amory, and everyone, hi.
Hi,
what came through really clearly actually was when there was some distraction going on. I'm also at my brother's house, and he has a rather new niece, and she's a year old, and I can hear her kind of crying in the background. And so there was some distraction. I was like, oh, we haven't been able to touch our own masculinity to even know what that is fully because of all the distraction that's happened. And so, and I don't know if I'm speaking from personal experience or if there's just so much distraction in the world that we're not actually able to let the divine masculinity that we're meant to, or that lives in us, actually come through fully. And so that's what I was really came alive when I noticed just the distraction here, and then the distractions that were happening on the call. And I was like, oh, we don't even know, we haven't even touched our masculinity. And so I might be projecting a little bit on the world there with that big statement, but yeah, that's what came through.
I love how the immediate moment just sort of informed you. It's like there was distraction, and like, what does that mean? What does it mean when we're not moving slow enough to feel anything? And like you're saying, what do we miss about our divine masculinity? What do we miss? Mm-hmm. Cool. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to do more exploration. We're going to do a little talk, but I thought what I wanted to do is just, this topic is so big, toxic masculinity. It's so grand, and it has so many different interpretations. So yesterday I felt like what would be helpful for me, and hopefully it will be helpful for you all, is that I did a tiny bit of research, and I wanted to frame what collectively I discovered about how our culture holds three different terms. The first one is traditional masculinity. The second one I looked up was toxic masculinity, and then the patriarchy. And so I wrote some things down. I'm going to share some of them. And then I just want to open it up. And I have some more kind of somatic things we could play with today if we're moved in that direction. So with the traditional masculinity, here's what Wikipedia says. I don't know how reliable they are, but masculinity, also called manhood or manliness, is a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles associated with men and boys. Traits traditionally viewed as masculine in Western society include strength, courage, independence, leadership, and assertiveness. This concept of manliness sometimes overly relies upon stoicism, dominance, aggression, and competitiveness at the basis of male integrity. And I think it was just interesting to me because when I read on further, I think so much of the conditioning has been about, for men, is being stoic, being the provider, being the caretaker, the one who's protecting essentially and providing. And we all have seen the whiplash effect of that when men aren't given a chance to actually feel their own emotions because they are so driven towards needing to be the provider. Some like the APA, the American Psychology Association, letting someone else in. They had this apparently just in the last couple of years, in the psychology world, they've had to expand the framework of how to address psychology for men. And so they have this guidelines for psychological practices with men and boys. And they say, this is in quotes from the APA, traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful, and that socializing boys to suppress their emotions causes damage that echoes both inwardly and outwardly. So I found, this is basically what our culture, in a very tiny snapshot, is saying about traditional masculinity. And then I wanted to turn and look at, okay, so how is our world defining toxic masculinity? And the main, I read a bunch of different articles, and the main thing that I got is basically toxic masculinity is sort of an archetypal image of what it means to be masculine. But the problem that with the toxicity is that these forms of masculinity are actually harmful to oneself and to others. And so this is why I was so interested in that Feminist on Cell Block Y, that documentary that's on YouTube, because they come at toxic masculinity from kind of they're using this woman, Bell Hooks. She's a feminist, and she wrote a book called The Will to Change. And they use that basically as their textbook. And she talks a lot about the patriarchy, and she talks a lot about, how men have been conditioned in a way to turn away from themselves. And so, but there are, they were talking about in this documentary that there are very specific things that the men learned they must do in order to belong, in order to feel that they have really their safety in the world is their belonging. And so I decided, just for the spirit of this conversation, that I would research the top 10 that stood out to me of the toxic masculinity traits. And so this is where I want to go through each one, and you can do whatever feels best for you, but I'm going to invite you again to turn inward, because I want to invite you to just feel what these terms do for you when you hear them, or these traits. What do you notice happening inside of you? And you can keep your eyes open if you prefer. So, and as I read them, just see if there's anyone in particular that really grabs your attention, because that might be an entry point for more of the conversation today. So the first one is being stoic. Men are constantly given the message that they must be self-reliant, independent, physically tough. Men are told that to be this way will make them successful in terms of business, society, and finding a partner. Being vulnerable will cause men to be ridiculed. That's being stoic. Now, the second one, being promiscuous. Typically, men will be praised by other men for sexual conquests. There's a well-known double standard regarding perceptions of male versus female promiscuity, with men being praised by their peers and called studs, while rejecting women who have multiple partners and branding them as sluts. So that's the second one, being promiscuous. Again, just notice what comes up for you. The third one is championing heterosexuality as an unalterable norm. Many men are programmed to react negatively to the concept of homosexuality, as it's a sign of deviating from the traditional male stereotype. Through popular rhetoric and from an early age, when boys are learning about gender roles, men are taught that to be homosexual is to be less masculine. The next one is being violent. Statistically, men commit significantly more violent crimes than women. There are numerous reasons for this, but there are clear links between male-instigated violence and the need men have to use aggression and violence to prove their masculinity and bolster confidence in their masculine identity. The next one is being dominant. To be preoccupied with power and dominance to the point that it causes harm to others, such as verbal, physical, or online bullying. One study found that over a quarter of the men thought that they should have the final word in a relationship, and over a third of men believed that they had the right to know where their female partner was at all times. So that's being dominant. The next one is sexual aggression towards women. Men who conform to toxic masculinity standards are more likely to make sexual comments or sexist jokes to women, commit sexual harassment, accept rape myths, and behave as if they're entitled to women's bodies. The next one is not displaying emotion. Emotion is treated as being a feminine characteristic. Stifling emotion is seen as true manliness. From childhood, males are shamed to conform with the standard that to show emotion is weak and feminine. And the next one is risk-taking. Toxic masculinity encourages risk-taking to demonstrate dominance. Men who buy into this are more likely to take extreme measures, such as perpetrative violence, drive dangerously, gamble, abuse drugs. And then the last one is not engaging in household chores and caregiving. Housework and child rearing are seen as feminine qualities. Being asked to do a feminine deemed task like housework, or being criticized by a woman for not cleaning appropriately is often interpreted as an emasculating assault and provokes defensiveness and aggression. So again, those are just what I found a number of different people speaking on this topic were suggesting are indicators of toxic masculinity. And you know, as I read these, I can see these qualities, many of them also in women too. But I just want to pause there and just see, is there anything that came up that you want to share as you were hearing any of them? Is there anyone that stood out to you? Anything that you're noticing about hearing the list itself?
Yeah, I think for me, stoicism is such a big part of it for me. And I think like the way in which that kind of generates and interacts with everything else on the list, I think is just so kind of deep in my life and so profound, where it's like, if I don't feel comfortable expressing emotions or needs or vulnerability, I feel like so many of these other behaviors are kind of a byproduct of that. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
If I can't tell someone that, you know, they've hurt me or that I want more or any of that, you know, what comes out, or at least I feel the urge is aggression and violence, you know, and it's just like, I'm just having this image of like, you know, kind of living in this cage and not having tools, you know, because of this stoicism and all these kind of things that we've learned. And, you know, what happens is just resorting to all these like maladaptive ways of dealing with that and feeling like I have no other option. So violence, aggression. I mean, even I think promiscuity, you know, it's like if I can't admit that a relationship isn't right for me because something, you know, I'm not allowing myself to be who I am in that relationship, and I'm not feeling, you know, like it's appropriate or okay to express that, you know, then, you know, I'm inclined to just kind of disavow the whole thing and look elsewhere instead of actually just recognizing something isn't healthy or good enough. And I think what's really kind of heartbreaking about it is how much it probably also reinforces these patterns in women. You know, it's if I mean, I haven't I don't know if I've done this in a long time, but if I can't have a conversation with someone and I just disappear, or I pull away, or I run into another relationship, you know, it's a missed opportunity for the partner to kind of learn what's actually going on, and probably just reinforces her own notion of, you know, what men actually are. And it's just such a missed opportunity, and it's like this vicious cycle that we keep perpetuating. So
Yeah. What are you noticing happening right now as you share? You shared so many gems there. What's
I don't know, from the moment this started, I've just felt like incredibly tender. Like I just like logged on. I was like, oh, I just want to cry, you know, like, and it's just not, I can't even point to something. It's just, that's just what I've been feeling like since I've been here. Yeah, just like a real sadness that just a deep sadness. Yeah.
I feel so grateful, because what you just opened up with around the stoicism and the way that can filter to all these different areas is so much based on the fact that there's not permission to feel, and you're doing such the counter to that right now in this, you know, space. And so I feel like you've just set a really deep tone for how tender and big and wide this topic is. And I'm grateful for you stepping in this way. Thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder if anyone wants to share anything they're appreciating about what James just brought, how it might be living in you, or what you've observed around something similar. Yeah, Lisa.
I'm so grateful for this conversation and for all the varying generations that showed up to have the talk. I have recently been through a couple of years of marriage counseling that was centered on this topic. And of course, we didn't name it that because it was too harsh to hear it in that way. But we were dealing with each one of like 8 out of 10 of these things that were just so entrenched. And so my husband's from the South. And so there's some really like harsh expectations in the South of what men are supposed to look like or not supposed to look like. But at the same time, I have boys that are probably close to James' age. And I'm just so noticing how they're changing this, how willing younger men are right now willing to break these stereotypes and to tap deeper in. And I was just imagining when James was sharing, I was just thinking, oh gosh, I hope my boys can do that. I really hope that my boys have that courage. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. It's so amazing, because I know that it's like we may not call the things these labels that I just read, but to your point, they were infiltrating because it's just so deeply conditioned, and it's so deeply conditioned. I've seen even in myself, you know, as I reflect back on my relationships, of reinforcing it as a woman, you know, like even the parts of me that grew up thinking I was supposed to have some, you know, I was taught you're supposed to have like a provider, and I never liked it, and I always railed against it. But then there was some part of me that wanted just to make sure someone was going to take care of me if it didn't go okay. And the pressure, I feel like, that just what that could bring into the field when I was married with my husband, it's amazing how deep this stuff goes. Yeah, so now I wanted to just see if there was anything else on those 10 qualities, but I want to just open it up. And I think there's already been so much richness seated here. But, you know, when I was thinking about well, when I was thinking about during the documentary, there's this really interesting part. So I think I should say just a tiny bit about the documentary, because it sort of speaks to, and the part about the patriarchy that I was talking about, kind of the three definitions. And so in this documentary, it's basically these inmates who have received this curriculum where they are with their prison mates they're kind of leading and facilitating a process around Bell Hooks's book, The Feminist, that I referred to earlier. The Will to Change is the book that they use. And they're talking about what it was like growing up in an environment where integrity, in a way, was learning how to compartmentalize. That means integrity. If you can compartmentalize things, then you're in integrity. And the problem with that is that then you're not in your wholeness. Then you're operating out of all of these disparate parts, kind of what James was alluding to. It's like one thing feels hard, then the other parts start acting out. And so they were talking about just the conditioning that happens. The three topics that they focused on was, men are taught to be athletic. And when they say athletic, they mean like aggression, violent kind of athletic, like football, things where there's contact, not ballet. It's like men are taught to be athletic in a way that gives them a channel for their violence and their repression, really. And then the second one is objectification of women, and the third was money, and how these men in prisons, like that is as they were talking about their own life journey, those were the main things that made them feel like even if they wanted to change and they wanted to not be so engaged in those values, that the women around them or the people around them were going to insist that they're the provider, that they're bringing home the money. And so it's like this one guy was in tears, just like, this is great here, but what do I do when I go out into the world? So I'm just bringing that part in because I think it's really, the whole thing was so poignant. There was one piece that, I think I just spoke to it, the part about compartmentalization, and how I think this is true for men and women, which is why it's such a rich topic of what are we taught that we shouldn't feel or experience in our lives? And then what happens as adults when we don't allow ourselves to enter into those spaces, like, whether it's emotion or our sexuality as women, it just feels like there's always some undercurrent of we're doing something wrong. So in terms of opening it up, I think we could do this in a couple of different ways. We could talk about how we have experienced this in our own lives, toxic masculinity, whether, whatever our gender is, whether it's our own personal journey, kind of like what the two of you did, Lisa and James, or how we're seeing in the world. So that's one angle we could take. And another, I think, is actually really important for us to look at, how do we reinforce it? Like James, you were talking about being in this cage and then not given tools. And that's for all genders around these topics. And so that's another place we could go, is just how do we discover the way that it's living in us, and then what do we do to repattern, invoke something new? So those are just some questions, and maybe you have something else you want to bring. Again, I don't want to make it too tight. I just want to lay that out there and see, is there anything personal that you want to, Lauren?
Thank you. Also, James, thank you. Appreciate you for being here today. Appreciate you for showing up the way you did there. The cage piece really rang for me, and I can't really define what makes up the cage, except that I I know it's there. I feel it. This subject has been something that has been in the fore for me for, well, I guess ultimately since Trump got elected in this country, and I knew there was going to be 4 years of chaos, and what really, I don't even know the word. What I really saw as the long-term detriment of it was that an entire new generation of young men got an example of this behavior leads to success by traditional definition. If you exhibit those characteristics, which Anne-Marie has laid out quite nicely, you can get elected president and continue the behavior for 4 more years and beyond as the leader of the free world. And man, it's just been crushing for me for 4 years as I have watched slowly this behavior rise up and it's not just men, it's women too. We've got a Marjorie Taylor Greene, you can go on down the tube, and by and large it's men, to the point of, we don't have what we want, so we're going to invade the Capitol and attempt to take what we want. And so this came up for me, and then there was this, at least for me, this term that started getting bandied about, this toxic masculinity term, and I went, yay, there's a name for that thing. We can get a container around it. It's identifiable. And so I was happy and cheered and used that term. And then this little voice came up in my head that kept asking, well, what's healthy masculinity? And I started asking around, and I either got no response at all, or the response was some version of, this and this and this, but those are really feminine traits or human traits. And I never was able to, from anybody, and I asked dozens and dozens of people in multiple forms, sort of what felt like a coherent or cohesive set of traits that define or are part of healthy masculinity. And so then I started having trouble with this term, because young men who are so, again, I'm using gender terms, and I really don't think this is a gender issue, but I'm going to continue with it anyway. Young men for whom it is so important to fit in, and fitting in means playing a role. You want to fit in, be the best one at baseball, be the one that everybody wants on their team for football. We're now going and saying, well, that aggressive behavior is toxic masculinity, and don't do that, and don't do that, and don't do that. And that, I don't think, works unless there's a don't do that and this, because the reinforcement that I think James and Lisa touched on for the behavior is it's all over the map. It's overt, it's subvert, it is pervasive. The encouragement to that sort of aggressive, I use the word violent, and I mean that in a lot of different ways. There's verbal violence and financial violence and physical violence and emotional, there's all kinds of violence that we've really we have to offer an alternative, and it can't be not that, because that just doesn't, that might work for me at 54, where, I'm more settled in my who I amness, but for a 12-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid, I don't think that's effective. And so ultimately I arrived at the challenge of this really not the problem. What I feel like is likely a dead end of gender identification of these behaviors. And while it is maybe by and large the behavior of men, it is certainly not all of that. And it starts to feel a little bit like, the trap of Jim Crow laws, or the trap of, don't ask, don't tell. And there's such an opportunity right now with so many things knocked loose in this country that have felt so rigid for so long. Pieces are apart, that there's this brilliant opportunity to reassemble them in a wiser, less violent, more cohesive way. And so anyway, that's kind of the background for me of how this has been turning around and why I brought it up, and especially amongst a wise group. And I think what I said on the Facebook thing is also really apt too. I feel like I'm sort of blindfolded in a minefield often. And I think I put it in the Facebook group, like, this is not, I'm not saying at all by trying to remove some of the gender piece from this, I'm not saying, all lives matter. I'm really going at here is, I think there's a way to talk about this and describe it that gives it a longer lifespan and takes away some, I think I posted that Josh Hawley thing, and he's going on and on about, oh, well, we're attacking manhood, and and you all just want men to be like women. And I think there's a way to just not provide that fodder for that crew of folks here. And I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll be quiet. And back to you, James. In the last 4 or 5 years, I have just had this welling up of grief in me that I have not been able to pin it on anything, and it just gets bigger and bigger. But there's a piece of it that is about this profound unnecessary violence. And I'm even catching it in my languaging. Several times in the last week, I've wanted to describe some writing as punchy, and I realized that very term is violent, and I'm then left without, like, I don't even know what other term to use. Like, the language doesn't leave me anything here. So anyway, that's a little bit about me in the background and why this has been in the fore for me. And I'm going to pipe down and just receive some wisdom here. Thank you.
Lauren, thank you so much. Jenny, I know you have your hand up, and I want to hear from you next. I just want to say there was so much I just received from that, but I want to just pull out 2 key pieces. I feel like what you're saying is there is a real gender issue here because of the conditioning. And like, you're not discounting that, but you're saying, like, how do we become a new species? How do we even frame this thing if it's not gender-based, which it's gender-based towards male right now because that's what our culture has done, and it has very particular flavors. But I feel like what you're putting in the center of the room right now is there a new definition that can actually become the antidote to this violence that lives in all of us? And if so, what would that look like? Is that a summary?
Yes, I think that's accurate. The other thing that's happened, I think, for a lot of humanity in the last 10 years is that we've come to realize that gender is not binary. Yeah. Perhaps biological. Well, not even that. Biological gender is not binary. We know that as well. And so it's a trap, I'm afraid, for agents of social change to drop this issue, or any issue really, into a context of binary gender that isn't really applicable. You know, it's a rainbow, you know, of gender, and so when we define anything in those terms, I'm afraid that I see the sun setting on binary gender terms for those of us who are kind of, you know, looking at things this way. And so bringing up something new and then caging, back to the cage, James, caging it in terms of binary gender it's sort of like when I filled my house with compact fluorescent light bulbs, and then 3 years later I went through and chucked them all and replaced them with LEDs. Well, maybe we do need the transitional language, but I think there's an opportunity to skip the transitional language too, and just say, look, that's toxic human behavior.
Yeah. I want Jamie and I want Jenny to speak, but I just want to say very quickly, I've kind of arrived at the exact same place as you're describing myself. It's just, yeah, and maybe we can pick that up again, but yeah, I'm kind of right there with you.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. So Jenny.
I don't know that I can compare to like what has been shared here so far. Everything that's been said is like created a pain in my chest, honestly. I was raised like a boy growing up, and I was taught to suppress my emotions, and I never really thought of myself as a toxic masculine before, although I've certainly questioned my gender identity, not necessarily because of anything inside of me, but because of how I fit into the society. And so I really appreciate the things that everyone here has shared. It's odd because I had similar feelings to what Jane had said earlier on the safety versus the danger of the masculinity. I had the same exact responses that she had, and yet I see myself as more masculine than feminine, and I'm working on making myself a more balanced, healthy person. But yeah, it's just been so much. And the Trump thing, like, I don't want to make this like any type of a political thing, but I had a mental breakdown when Trump was elected. Like, I've been raped and sexually abused on so many occasions, partly because I live within a man's world. And I was sick in bed for 2 days just trying to understand how our country elected such a person. And it's just so indoctrinated into our society that those toxic behaviors are what makes us successful. They certainly haven't made me happy in my life, and the people that I really admire to be like and look forward to don't display those characteristics. So just thank you everyone for sharing, and I have a long way to go to be a well-developed person, but it's good to know that everyone struggles with these things as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. I feel like when you said you have a long way to go, I feel like actually you're right. We're all right in the same soup. It's like whatever our version of is dismantling this toxic humanity. And I appreciate you just, bringing forward, like, you've had a lot of experience that would indicate it's not safe. And like, how do you navigate in the world when your body has been violated multiple times in multiple ways, and have your heart open and find a way through? And I think it's like what you're doing, using your voice and bringing forward the question, being in the question and not being in it alone feels so important. So I'm glad you're feeling the solidarity of the people here. Thank you. So Jamie, you had, Jamie's.
Hey.
Okay. Oh, there you are. Hi. Hollywood Squares moves around.
I was raised in the South, and So I have a awesome brother and dad who are very much traditional masculine folks. But James and Lauren, what I'm really, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate you sharing your truth and your tenderness, because I haven't gotten to see that really very much. And so it was just a gift to be able to see men express themselves. And so I was just really touched. And what it gifted me was a tenderness in my own heart. I noticed an opening in my own heart with that, and it was so beautiful. And so I just wanted to say thank you, and everyone sharing. And then I also really appreciated the toxic human traits, because I noticed my own toxic masculinity, if you will, if you want to call it that. And what was arising in me when we were speaking about masculinity was that we actually suppress the feminine so much. And in our current culture, if you want to call it a culture, we're moving more towards this patriarchal kind of way. And so women, and not to be gender, but all of us, I guess, are there's this movement towards becoming more and more traditionally masculine. And so in my own body, I've noticed a lot of the masculinity traits that are more on the toxic side. So I really appreciated the human toxic traits. And I just wanted to share yesterday what came up for me, and how just a real life experience of this helplessness, that how that showed up. There's the helplessness so my brother was on a call. He works for a big corporation, and he was on a call, and he wasn't, this fellow was, not, just being a real jerk for whatever reason, and probably some fear or whatever you want to call it. And my brother felt like he couldn't express himself, like he couldn't say, like, and I just noticed this helplessness in him. And so my own masculine, whatever, learned conditioning was like, I want to fix it, and I'm over here like big sister, like I'm going to beat this guy's, ass for messing with my little brother. And like what I met, my brother was like, trying to fix it. And so I noticed my own helplessness, but how I met that was with violence. And then I was running on the bridge as this, athlete after, and I just what came through was like, oh man, we've learned this like learned helplessness. And so one of the things, Anne-Marie, that you asked is like, what tools do we use? It's like our body is actually the tool that is meant to unlearn these conditions. And where we don't go is in the body. And our whole entire culture again, has tried its best to strip that. And so I think that where our power lies is actually inside. And so that's the main tool to use to do what is currently here. And so and how that lived in my body was just like this tension that was like in between my shoulder blades, and I was like, ha. So I just wanted to share that. That's what I have to offer in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so much to say on that. Hulani, I know you have your hand up, so you want to go next. Jamie, that was beautiful. I want to come back to something you said. Oh, Hulani, your sound's not on. But it looks like it is.
There.
Okay, there we
Got
go.
it?
Yeah.
I feel so deeply the grief that is present in the room. Yeah. It moves my heart. And it's such a well of feeling that is welling up. So I really want to appreciate each and every one of you for bringing that. And also, what keeps rising up to share is that even in the spiritual communities of awakening man, how the toxicity of masculinity shows up, like warrior training. Every man that has returned from these kinds of trainings that I've worked with, they all expound the toxic masculinity, the negative side of the warrior, but with the focus of spiritual exploration, like aggression and hetero-ness and dominance, to really find the masculine in themselves, but nowhere do they go into the feeling realm. Nowhere do they go into the body in the sense of really feeling into the body. They're in the body in that athletic sense of, right? But they don't listen to Mother Earth. So it's so prevalent that what I want to say as I witness it all is it's so prevalent because it's part of our colonization. It's so part of our domestication, which really is the metal bars of that cage that you have spoken of here. So if we were really to come to center in our bodies and source the dynamics of creation, what would the noble masculine look like? If man explored the noble within themselves, what would that look like for each of you? Because it's there, living and well and waiting at the bottom of that grief.
I just want to invite everyone to just notice what's happening in your body right now. Yulani, just one last piece on that. You said the noble masculine, and then you said man, and I'm wondering if you're speaking gender, if you're speaking man as in humanity, or
Both.
Yeah. Okay.
Because until we explore the domestication through gender,
Yeah.
man is still presenting. So as we dive into the places where we are colonized and domesticated, then that starts to expand to discover ourselves beyond gender into humanity as a vehicle for spirit to give back to the planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I didn't catch who had their hand up next, Lisa or Jake first. So whoever feels moved.
It was Jake.
Okay, thank you for tracking that. Jake, you're on.
I think where I'll start is where you started today when you asked about confusing, and to me, masculine is incredibly confusing. For many reasons, partly because I sit somewhere on the Asperger's autism spectrum, so a lot of things don't naturally make sense to me. And so I did the thing of go and read, and I discovered, a lot of things that have been written about toxic masculinity, and I appreciate the viewpoint. It gives something to go with. And one of the things that I found myself doing was sort of the pendulum from, okay, if that's the toxic masculine, then do the opposite. And that's not necessarily great either. So then you look for what's a healthy masculine, and there's certainly, you can find, I don't know how many articles or books on what might constitute something of a healthy masculine. And those are somewhat equally confusing because there's no definitive list. And that probably shouldn't be a definitive list either. But some of those lists are conflicting. Some even include some of the traits that might be considered toxic masculine. And I find myself kind of at this point of life of kind of trying to unlearn, or I guess unlearn is probably a good word, to come back to what might be more natural or real, and see where that fits or lands for me, because I think there is what's healthy and what's good for you, good for the world, and then there's also what is it that's true for you. When you talk about gender identity or gender expression, where do you land in those? And I think the other thing that I want to bring up a little bit is that there are spectrums to a lot of these traits. So I'll just take aggression as one of them. Aggression can be dangerous, it can be toxic, it can be lethal, and it can also serve a purpose. If you're trying to protect, you've got literally a lion or something facing you down, aggression's a good thing to have. That's not something you want to lose either. Even I don't remember who mentioned the word punchy, but yes, punchy has an aggressive feel to it. It can also be lighthearted. And so what's your intention with that? Or the warrior side? A warrior side can be very toxic, and it can also, the other side of it is being very noble. I don't feel like I've got any answer to directions around masculine in myself, or I might like to see it in the world. Just knowing that a lot of what does seem to come out is not very healthy.
I'm just going to ask you before you sign off, what do you notice happening inside as you name all of this and you bring so much richness, like you're putting more pins on the map? What's happening for you?
I think it's just always good to acknowledge kind of what's true. The confusion has been there for a while. I don't necessarily know what's going to change that yet. But I appreciate the topic and the opportunity to kind of share and speak and listen to others here as well.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Lisa, and then Jane.
So my day job, I spend a lot of time with executives and in corporate America. And I've also spent about 5 years on the beliefs that empower police violence. So I've really like dove through the research on some of these institutional structures that are actually formed on a certain type of masculinity. And so I'm just going to tease out this question of reinforcing. Like, what is it that we do to reinforce it? I will say that in my explorations through oppression, especially with a racial lens, My Grandmother's Hands is a great book. That for me, like the subline is, when Europeans came over here, we came over with a particular kind of trauma in our bodies and in our ancestral bodies, and that we are still working with trying to unlearn sort of that default setting of war, and that we brought this with us for generations, and that we're going to have to unlearn the warlike mentality with everything. So I actually think that toxic masculinity is just a mechanism of that, a component of that. Greater, as Helani said, colonization, a piece of colonization of our colonization culture. And I think that it also has caused atrophy and collapse in women generationally, because so much of the dominant space was reserved for a particular type of man, and everything else has sort of led us to still be searching for our own power and our own internal warriorship in a positive way. But what I will say the most about is that when I am working with an executive who is saying, my people are complaining, they need to stop whining, stop acting like a girl. I have executives who say all these things. At the end of the day, those institutions and those industries are created by belonging. We have a natural wiring to feel like we belong in a village. And if that is the way that we reinforce it, then that's also the way out of it, is that we have to create safety and belonging for a different way of being. And the more of those spaces that people have the option to choose and be involved in, the less we will reinforce generation after generation. I have millennial young executives coming onto the scene now and getting power in institutions that don't recognize how they think and don't recognize how they feel, and are not used to, being socially connected in this web that I think millennials have known that the rest of us were taught to compartmentalize or negate. And the more we can create spaces that don't amputate parts of people, the more there will be a tipping point. We're ready. We're all ready. All the things are pointing us towards this awakening from our own colonized minds. But entire institutions and industries have been built around toxic masculinity. Corporate America, Western medicine, the justice system, right? All the things that sort of our structures, our pillars in our society, they're built on those characteristics. So it's up to all of us to create spaces, whether it's men's groups or, coffee breaks with people at work, that they can have real conversations and have real feelings. All those things we can create it. Would be my 2 cents.
You've been so deeply steeped in this. I can feel it. Thank you. And that whole piece around the reinforcement of just like that really rung around safety and belonging, and how that's how we create a new reality. It's through that, not through the traits. Like, yeah. My heart feels so full. There's so much richness here. I'm just going to give it some space and see what wants to come next. Something's coming up. there was so much love that you just brought through, Jane, when you spoke. I just really appreciate, like, that's been happening actually with every single one of you. And there's something about this invitation for the belonging and the safety that we're talking about really is like the foundation of embodying love. And how can we keep welcoming everything? And we, like to your point, it's so hard to welcome certain parts. And yet there's something so beautiful. And I saw some heads nodding, and I felt like there was an acknowledgement energetically, Jane, when you were talking about sometimes you just need to go into the intellect because it feels good and it's helpful. Like we need to compartmentalize at certain points. It's sort of like the spectrum that Jake brought up earlier. It's like, how do we navigate trusting our own inner authority when we have so much personal conditioning and we have so much ancestral conditioning? And I think we do it together. Like there's something about creating enough safety where we can really help open those doors and see. I know for myself, I can root so much more deeply in accepting parts of me when I'm seeing other people do it too. So I'm just feeling that right now.
Anne Marie, Rich has his hand up. I don't know if you could see
Oh,
him.
I didn't see it. Thank you.
Yellow
I'm so glad we're all
yellow.
working. It's funny.
Thank
It's
you,
better than
Jamie.
this corner. Everybody's got each other's back. Thank you, Jamie. Rich, I'd love to hear from you.
I think I just get used to sitting and listening. Wonderful the movement of energy and openness with the group, from the vulnerability and that sadness. I think this is one thing that I have felt strongly, and it actually came out a couple of weeks ago very clearly in a mindfulness class I was doing for the Council on Aging. So I've got people there all my age and older, which is older than 70, by the way. So it's a different group with different experiences, and yet a curiosity and a desire to learn and grow. And we were getting into the process, and this is the process of becoming more mindful. So it's a mindful meditation and learning how actually to shift consciousness. That was just being introduced this week, and that's been my real focus for the past 3 or so decades. And what I was sharing, and one of the guys who was a Vietnam vet tuned up and he said, are you saying in a way that some people are just too sensitive for this world? And I could feel the emotion move in me. Mm-hmm. And I said, not exactly, but you have to be willing to experience great suffering. If you're not open to it, this world just becomes a dried up kernel. The only way to bring life energy through it is to open to what, I think as Jane was saying, what's there, what's presented to us. And the beauty in the juxtaposition going from the individual sadness and pain, which I certainly felt in that moment, to that opening up to the larger picture, which is so critical now. I never in my life had I expected to live through a time when, yeah, I can handle pockets of toxic masculinity here and there, and little groupings of it here and there. But I've got, from best I can see, about a third of my country that is operating out of toxic masculinity as though it's a verse from the Bible. This is religion to these folks. And it's nasty and it's cruel. And to be open to that is to realize all the suffering created. So I think when we can acknowledge that and realize stepping into this is not easy. And it is, to me, a form of being a warrior in the healthiest, most pure way. Because think of it like this. If we don't meet what is coming at us, who will? Who's going to stop it? It will not stop of its own. So if I'm in an individual situation where that lion's coming, or it's a person behaving horribly, trying to hurt a friend or a family member, do I stand by? And this leaves me at a very tough spot in many ways, because love is the core. It absolutely is a transcendent thing. The word doesn't fit. I mean, it's just, but the idea too of being able to bring that loving energy forward, to not back off. And this is one thing most of us have noticed with certainly men in our life. When they get real loud, when they get real angry, 90% of the people around are going to back off. They're going to back up. They don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. So we're quiet in the locker room at really crude, rude jokes. So we back off when the bullies are beating up on the kid in the yard. Is every world war not something of that nature? So I think here, to me, it's partly being part of a group where we explore and support the openness, support, the goodness, that we lead with love. And we meet what is out there with love. But that's going to take often a kind of energy that many of us find uncomfortable, because we don't want it. I don't want it. I don't want it. I do not want to use my life energy moving in a way to stop something bad from happening. I want to stop it. But what a misuse of life's gift. So I think it's a very challenging time. And I always remember too when it comes, Einstein and others have said it, this idea that the consciousness that has created the problem is not the consciousness that will get us out of the problem. And I seldom hear really too much of a new consciousness. And we need to bring that new consciousness in. And it's all in what you say. It's there. But until we know how to shift that consciousness, it's sort of diluted in a way, and it doesn't have the focal point that hate does. Hate organizes very quickly. Love is a lot more diffuse. It's very powerful, but we got to learn how to bring it together and all. So I appreciate the sensitivity and the caring and the wisdom of everybody here, and thank you for organizing this, providing this opportunity.
Thank you. I just love what you brought. It seems like a few times I just had tears like coming up, and then they didn't like come out of my eyes, but there's just this feeling of this is a time in a way where there is aggressive energy that's needed. And what I mean by that is what you were talking about, is stopping the thing from happening, stopping it from steamrolling the entire planet and all the species that abide here. And this is where, back to Jake's comment earlier about the spectrum, I mean, I just think staying in these open dialogues and really feeling through our own body, and like going back to what Jane said, like clearing out our own, what I call like dismantling our own conditioning. Like that is, every single one of us that's doing that is paving the way for something new, but there is sort of an acceleration right now given what we're seeing in our country. That's just a wake-up call. And so, I love, and Helani, I want to hear from you next. I just want to weave back in what you said, Lisa. It's just like we reinforce it around this whole notion of we bond by the safety and belonging, but we're bonding through these patterns and these beliefs that have more power than love right now, like the hatred. And so, like, there's just so much here. There's just so much here.
Just one last thing on that is,
Yeah.
because I've been watching this and working with it for decades now, and the love is more predominant. There's more of it, and that's what scares the daylights out of those who won't be vulnerable. They're terrified, because what terrifies them the most is truth and love and reality. And it's coming real strong, and that's why everything's being distorted and moved the other way if they can. But can imagine the level of hurt and woundedness there. But it's never to underestimate the absolute horror that they are doing and will do. So we have to be prepared for that, even as we offer love and we offer the rest. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, man, that was beautiful. Thank you. Helani. Bye, Jake.
Funny, I've jotted down some notes here in listening to everyone. As I go to speak to them, nothing's coming out. I want to speak to awareness and attention, because that's how energy moves. To remember that all of what we've spoken to here has been imprinted. That's all it is an imprinted pattern. And if we continue to wallow in what isn't right, then we'll simply create more of what isn't right. So I want to speak into this powerful collective to bring our attention and awareness into what it is that's imprinted in our DNA of our becoming. Who and what are we becoming as a humanity? To really explore that in the depths of our being, and recognizing that nature has a natural ability to repattern toxic systems. If it isn't working, she knows how to recalibrate and make anew. Centuries after centuries, the earth has demonstrated that natural ability. And we have that ability within us as part of nature. So, in the recognition that love stirs up that which is not in alignment with what is natural and cohesive and wise, I want to speak the call to really tap into our junk DNA, where our future humanity lives, to really source that and allow ourselves to become the beauty of that.
Well, we're at time, and it feels there's so much richness here, and I certainly don't see this being the one and only conversation by any means. So I will welcome you all back to do more if that appeals to you. And I think what I'd like to do in closing is just, if you feel moved, just to come back on and just share something that you are feeling in this moment, or something that you want to keep looking at in the coming days around this whole topic, or just a word of where you are, just to bring your voice back in. And just again, only if you feel moved. And if you have to jump off because we're at time, please do so. Yeah. James. Bye, Jennifer.
Yeah, I think this, yeah, it's been really surprising for me just to feel like, oh my God, how much I need this, you know, and, you know, like I wasn't even sure why I was like crying before I showed up today. And it's just like, oh my God, there's a part of me that really knows I need this. And I think, you know, what we're talking about here is ultimately getting back in touch with that part of ourselves. And I think in the absence of connection in places like this, it's really hard to even know what that part is, or, you know how to connect with it. And I'm just seeing so many kind of overlapping themes here, you know, in the discussion of, you know, connection, but also, you know, how do we redefine masculinity? And then comments about, you know, being in the body, and then, you know, focusing on the other, and the need for community. And you know, I don't think there's necessarily a simple answer, but I think I think what's so confusing about this is that even in our attempts to break out of this cage, we resort to many of the tools that have put us in that cage in the first place. And I think that's what Lauren is maybe touching on in, you know, this frustration with, why do we have to redefine masculinity? Isn't abstraction on some level maybe part of the problem? And then, you know, to Jamie's point, you know, reconnecting with the body, and I think I'm still figuring out, you know, what, you know, how much should I be focusing on the other and people dealing with this? And sometimes to me, I think that's an important question, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but I also know that focusing on the other is a part of the problem for me as well, you know, and it's in trying to fix the world, it's very easy to start ignoring my body and the need for connection in these places. And you know, so no simple solution, but I do think there's just so many themes kind of overlapping here, and I'm not sure I synthesized them in any way, but yeah, obviously, yeah, in some ways, I think just bringing awareness of how even the kind of solutions we may be trying to come up with are themselves maybe part of what we're trying to escape. And I feel like in a space like this, there's something about sharing with people that I think there's kind of a collective wisdom that is very clarifying for me. And when I try to do this by myself, I you know, I can generate a lot of traps. And so I really appreciate this time with everyone here. And it feels like, yeah, there's much more clarity I'm able to tap into than when I'm just out there in the world on my own. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, James. Anyone else? I noticed, Cheryl, I think you raised your hand this way. Do you want to?
Hi,
Okay.
thanks. I'll keep it brief. Thank you very much. Again, another fabulous week. And I always find that reinforcing to come into the collective and discover how the themes are playing out in my life currently, and how we touch on them from week, or I guess from month to month when we join. And I think what I took away from this today mostly is toxicity means something is out of balance. And so if something is extremely toxic masculinity, however we've defined that, that means we might be out of balance in the feminine. And I'm really hoping that we're more embracing the feminine, coming out of the masculine. I believe it was Jamie earlier that felt we were moving to a masculine kind of generation. And I'm really hoping we're coming into the softness. And where it goes back to, I think, is while we're growing up and we have these feelings that show up, it's like an innate way of staying safe. Our feelings show up. When our parents don't know how to deal with those feelings, they're objectified and classified. That's too masculine. That's don't be a sissy. Don't, oh, you're crying. Well, why don't we go back to the child and just, or even our own inner child, and work with our feelings and just start that process. And I think the term was called discernment. Mm-hmm. When we can discern what we're feeling, we might have a different reaction to our surroundings. Because this week I found myself employing the toxic masculine to try and get my point across to a child. So thank you, everybody, for all of your support and clarity and vision and willingness to make and recognize that there's a change needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. So good to have you. So good to have you. I just have one thing coming up. I'm realizing that fumbly thing that happened at the beginning about recording and wanting to share it is because now I didn't know this at the time. I wouldn't normally, that just feels inappropriate to like the privacy, but there's a part of me that so wants the world to just experience what we went through. And I think that's where that was coming from. And I didn't know it at the time, but what just happened to me is, it's like a new grid, you know, just the energetics of us coming together and the vulnerability and the honesty and the grief and the questions and the surrender and all of it. It feels, the frequency that we've just created is something that I wish the world or more people could touch, because I think there's so many more of us. And to James's point just now, we don't get to access this as much when we're on our own. Like there's something about being in and hearing one another where some things get activated more. So I'm just realizing why that was such an awkward moment for me. And I was just following what was happening in the moment. I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. But then this other part of me is like, yeah, you do. And now I see why. So. Lauren.
Yeah, I think what you said is just wonderful. And I'm glad that you said it as it came up for you. It's so important. The other, that sort of violent, toxic behavior is so prevalent. And, you know, open CNN and boom, there it is. And it's, be afraid of this. And here's a horrible thing that happened. And this person's violating that person. We aren't going to see the change that I think the folks in this group want to express from their hearts if we're not willing to live out loud with it. I certainly haven't said anything today that I would feel concerned about having on YouTube or anywhere else. And part of what drives that for me is what I just said. the other behavior, the peaceful, considered, in touch from that center behavior needs to be out there and modeled, because I'm answering my own question now from the beginning. That is the healthy human behavior.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to say to a kid, an 8-year-old or a 6-year-old, no, do this. It is an entirely different energy and weight to just do it and let the kid see. Kids are remarkable bullshit detectors. Remarkable. I mean, my kids would call me on stuff that I wasn't even aware of. They still do. And so I challenge each person here to stretch a little bit in the coming weeks, to take what feels like a risk. And really, I would even recast the term vulnerability, and really look at it. Does this behavior, does this expression, this more whole state of being really cause me? Generally, that's a genuine open question to the folks here. Let's go live out loud, just a little bit more in the coming weeks, and reinforce the ideas of the results of that behavior with some actual data.
Sorry, Lauren, the question when you posed it, I think it cut off. I don't know if it's other people at like a crucial moment. So can you say it again?
Which part?
The vulnerability.
Reframing vulnerability. Can you?
Yeah, we've the term vulnerability has been used to describe sort of this space that we've been in for the last hour and 42 minutes. The openness and sharing and I guess what comes up for me in the moment that I said was, well, gosh, is that really a state of vulnerability? Is that level of openness, more whole being? I wonder if it isn't. Well, in fact, I know from my years ago, I sat in a training, and I was in my 20s. I was 24, in fact, just started with a Fortune 100 company, and in the midst of this sort of way out there training at the time, while I was on the spot in a chair, what came up for me was, oh my God, I'm gay. And I'd never had any thought like that before. And for whatever reason, I had the clarity to say it out loud in front of the whole group of all my coworkers. And it, of course, went all over the company in 2 minutes. But I realized in that moment, like, well, shit, I'm not held hostage by that anymore. I'm not trying to hide that anymore. And it's in that hiding out that there's actual vulnerability. The openness of the behavior, this is who I am, this is the more whole of who I am, is really a powerful, safe place rather than trying to hide it. So that's what I was sort of challenging a little bit is this sort of space that we've been in for the last hour and a half vulnerable space, or is sort of the status quo, or I call it TikTok or domestic, whatever term you want to use, is that actually the vulnerable space where I'm trying to keep something from folks, my sensitivity, my emotion, my grief, so did that answer your question, James? Did I get it? Okay.
Thanks. Well, I'm moved so deeply by this experience with you all, so deeply. And Lauren, thank you for initiating the topic. I know 2 other people that wanted to be part of it couldn't make it today, so I'm sure I'll give them a little debrief, but thank you all so much for your presence and the love and the depth that you brought today. I feel changed in such a good way, like just deepened. And yeah, I'd like to continue this. So be on the lookout for more invitations. I think more frequency, maybe even on this topic about the toxic human, or even reframing until the human of becoming, or whatever, but just to continue these conversations. So